Mika, you have said for some time, I've heard you say for some time, that this idea that the media is objective and straight down the middle, you say that's utter nonsense.
Well, I mean, does anyone here think that the media is completely objective?
Right.
And there's different, different problems at different places. I think that obviously we have the cable net. We'll talk about television and just take one slice of it. Cable, you've got right television, left television, down the middle television that no one watches, and within that, what do you really get out of it, unless you are very well versed yourself in the issues? On the networks, news coverage is diluted by a lot of garbage. That's really not news, and they've sort of lost sight of news and entertainment in some programming. And then in other more serious news programs on networks, you could argue there's a lot of liberals that put together the broadcasts. You could argue that it's hard to find conservatives that help put together the broadcast, depending on where you work. Back to this ad.
I want to ask you, though, really quickly, because I read something that Mark wrote years ago when he was writing the note. You say the media's biased, and you say it's a liberal bias, and that Americans would be better off if people just said, this is what I believe, and this is where I come from.
I would love to know what the panel thinks of this, because at this point, especially in the television world, it just seems silly to me. If I were to go back to CBS and be a correspondent for CBS, or NBC or ABC, where I've worked, for all these years, I've been the same person. I'm a Democrat. You know where I grew up, you know what my worldview is, but yet I had to pretend to be something else when I was at CBS and put my objective voice on. I don't understand why reporters don't just
I think these two things are interrelated, actually. I think the media doesn't have necessarily a liberal or conservative bias. They have a bias towards conflict. They like to see people going at each other.
I don't think that's true.
Well, let me finish. And then...
that's just not even close to being true. And I'll go to Mark Halperin next. But if you look at him, by the way, you finish your homework and then you'll be allowed to talk in front of a dinner guest.
It's right here.
I want you to finish up.
You don't think the media has a desire to see people at each other's throats?
I think the broadcast networks are overwhelmingly liberal. I think the most power. In fact, I don't think I know. I've been there. My best friends are in the media in New York, and I think they do their best. But
my presumption
how many
is that
Republicans? What do you think the percentage
well,
of Republicans?
My presumption is that, and this is just from my sort of observation of what clicks well, for instance, online. You could get metrics from any number of sites. Predominantly, what works well online is when you're reporting some sort of conflict and just blow it up into something that's way more intense than it really is. So you'll see headlines that says so-and-so goes nuclear, or so-and-so slashes or hits. And these verbs that are just not appropriate for the actual issue that you're discussing. I'm not saying they're wrong to use, they're just overemphasizing it. And I think that sort of underscores what's a real problem in news, which is that we like to think that what we write is of critical importance. And so we play it up so that every reader thinks it's of critical importance. And it's exaggerating the value of the news. And what I was going to say, how it ties into that welfare ad, just to tie this all together, is that one of the sort of knee-jerk reactions for reporters is to say, okay, this ad was run, what's the Obama campaign's response? As opposed to stepping back and saying, okay, this ad was run, does it actually get to a factual issue? Is it factually correct? So our first instinct is to say, okay, what's the response and pushback, as opposed to stepping back and saying, let's examine the issue.
Hey, Mark, I've got two questions for you. Question number one, why don't you have a reporter's notebook like Sam Stein?
Yeah.
And question number two, because he looks like a reporter. He's got a notebook. Where's my notebook?
You're not a reporter.
I don't know about the boat shoes.
Seriously. We're not going sailing today, Sam.
You never Woodward chasing Nixon in Sperry boatside, like topsiders.
I feel like my outfit is being overly scrutinized on this thing.
Well, we're biased against people that come here like they're ready to go to like the Greenwich Boat Show. But anyway, that's our bias. I'm joking, Sam. But Mark, you wrote several years ago in the note, I remember, we talked about how there is a built-in bias. Now, I don't care. I've always said if the three major networks were in Manhattan, Kansas, there would be a different worldview than the three in Manhattan. I know everybody's doing the best job they can do. But what do you think about Mika's suggestion that people say, yes, this is what I believe, And it's like, for instance, as a Republican, when I look at that ad and I go, that's a bunch of garbage. People are like, the Republicans even saying it. Is this sort of false sense of objectivity what handcuffs us from being able to come out and tell the truth about ads like this?
No, I mean, as John said, these are big, complicated things. I try to focus less on analyzing what's going on or making judgments about the level of bias or the nature of the bias, and try to think about how to solve it and how to make it better. Because I think in a democracy, you need objective, trusted sources of news. It's in the course of my career, and going back a couple decades before that, even if you don't believe, as some deny, that there's liberal media bias in a lot of the so-called mainstream media, what I tell people is recognize that for generations, half our country has thought that there was, and that that's a reality. Every Republican running for office thinks the deck is stacked against them. There are other biases. There's a pro-conflict bias as well. But what I'd like to see is a recognition that you're going to have left-wing media and right-wing media that sometimes is acknowledged and sometimes isn't. But again, I'll say, any democracy, I think, to have a well-informed electorate that can participate in the national town square needs news organizations and individual journalistic brands that are seen as credible, objective, and non-ideological. I try to check all my biases as much as I can. If you go on my Wikipedia entry, you'll see I've been attacked pretty regularly by both the left and the right. My colleagues
That's a badge of honor.
My colleagues say it means I'm doing something right. My mother says it means I'm doing everything wrong. But
Yeah.
but you have to have those organizations. We have fewer of them, and unfortunately, a lot of the ones that some of our colleagues would put forward in saying this is an objective organization. I think again, if you sat in an editorial meeting and listened to them talk about Pat Buchanan or George Bush versus how they talked about Nancy Pelosi and Dennis Kucinich, you'd see there's a lot more liberals than there are conservatives.
You talk about solving things or making things better. Wouldn't transparency do that? Wouldn't knowing exactly who you're hearing from and who they voted for? What if every reporter just disclosed?
I'm all for that, but I think we should
What's wrong with it?
we should have individuals who don't have that orientation, whose attitude is I'm here to represent the public interest rather than liberals or conservatives or Republicans or Democrats.
Well, and the problem, there is a problem. Just to take a
Still can do
hypothetical,
that.
Joe points out that ad is false,
Right.
demonstrably false. So Barack Obama did not end the work requirement for welfare. There are a lot of things he did. You can debate the merits of his policy, but that is factually untrue. So how does it help the conversation if I say, I'm John Heilemann, I'm liberal, and I'm now going to tell you that this ad is not false? Because for a lot of people, if they heard, well, he's liberal and he's saying this ad is false, they immediately say, I can discount his criticism of the ad.
Right.
And the ad, they hear now that anything I say about it is now opinion, and I'm rendered
What,
incapable.
you need to tell me you're a liberal?
Well,
I'm serious.
But I'm using myself as just take any journalist.
Right.
Joe Blow journalist stands up and says, I vote Democrat, I'm a liberal,
Right.
and now I'm going to tell you that this ad is false. For 50% of the country, they won't hear the truth or falsity of the ad. They will
Okay,
hear
first of
that is
all-
a biased opinion, and I can now discount it and move on.
Okay, I don't think people need to walk around with sandwich boards. I just don't think it needs to be hidden. And then perhaps ultimately down the road, we would have a more balanced media because we would try and balance out the numbers, wouldn't we?
I think part of the problem, though, and having just come through that gauntlet with the press as national chairman, there was more written about my 10 years chairman than I think any chairman in the history of the party. Some of it I invited, others I did not.
All of it really flattering, too.
All of it so flattering. But let me give you an example. I think one of the things I discovered, it's certainly not just as national chairman, but as lieutenant governor of Maryland and certainly as a candidate for the United States Senate in 2006, that what I see the press doing a lot of times is buying into a narrative that comes from the political class. And they perpetuate this narrative irrespective of the facts. Case in point, there was a little episode about a staffer at the RNC during my tenure who decided to take some of our donors out to a club in Los Angeles.
That was a problem.
Now,
And not just any club.
not just any club.
This was a club.
It was a particular style of club at which some wonderfully exciting things would transpire.
And clothing was optional.
And clothing was definitely optional.
And why was I not invited on this RNC
And that's
trip?
what I wanted to know. And this is the thing. By that point in my tenure, a certain narrative about my chairmanship had begun to evolve that the press decided to participate in liberally. And what was interesting was, despite the fact that I was not there, that I was some 3,000 miles away at a meeting that I was hosting for the party, certain members of the press continued to write their stories to infer that I was there. Why? Because it furthered the narrative about my chairmanship. And number two, it fulfilled whatever particular agenda that was supporting and pushing that narrative out of the political class. So you have this, I think, this sort of symbiotic relationship between some members of the press and some members of the political class that are fulfilling agendas that are outside of the interests of the public. Now, if I were legitimately there and participating in those activities, which unfortunately I was not at the time, fine, that's the story, and then you make that part of the story. But as we confronted some of the editors on this, and the response back was, it's a better story to infer that he was there.
You keep staring at me.
I know, but your publication was actually very good about it and was not part of
Thank you.
the problem. And what I also found was there was a lot of that bias came from within my own family. Right. So a lot of it was driven by conservative media, the Washington Times and others.
I think this sort of makes my point, though, is that story was a wonderful clickbait. I mean, people really loved to read about it.
Oh, I bet
and
they
I think
did.
the bias towards journalism, as much as it might have been sort of, it fed a narrative that, whatever narrative, an anti-Michael Steele narrative was out there, it also really fed the bottom line for these websites because it involved all of these salacious things that sometimes happen in politics, irrespective of whether or not you were there. And so that was really like a market-driven sort of bias right there. And one other point I want to make is I have this sort of free market view of how reporters gain credibility in sort of the online world, which is that you can write an immense amount of material, and if you don't gain the people's trust with your work and with your reporting over a period of time, then people end up sort of dismissing your opinions.
Isn't bad behavior also rewarded, though, whether you talk about being online or on cable news at night?
I don't think it's rewarded so much as it's not punished. Like, you can get stuff wrong online and then come back and then...
And extremists will click on it on both sides.
Yeah, and I think that's a real problem.
On both sides.
I think that's a real problem. But I do think that, if you're a reporter and you work for an outlet such as mine, which has a perception of an ideological leading, obviously, Huffington Post, you can still gain credibility if your reporting stands up to factual analysis. And I think that's a good thing about internet journalism, which is there's a lot more stuff out there for people to read and for people to check you and make sure that you can earn their trust.
So let's move on now and talk about, for our friends who don't live in the United States, give a little bit of an overview about what's happening in this campaign. You guys obviously are the preeminent reporters on presidential campaigns right now. One of the things that I've noticed, especially over the past 4 to 8 years, has been how insulated, how isolated, how bubble-wrapped the presidential candidates have become. Barack Obama, without really being called on it 4 years ago, was great at staying away from the press, staying away from getting the questions, by putting out things on the internet. John McCain, not so effective. Sarah Palin, even less so. 4 years later, Mitt Romney, good luck asking him a question if you're not on Fox News. I mean, these guys are getting more and more insulated. The president's more and more insulated. Why are both major candidates able to get away with this in 2012, Mark?
Well, because the press...
Well, first of all, do you agree with that? Do you agree with that reality? And if so, why are they able to get away with it?
Well, I mean, early in my career, the first campaign I covered full-time, 92, we had so much access to the candidate I covered that sometimes we'd be flying on the plane with him, and he'd come to the back of the plane at night to talk to us, and we'd pretend to be asleep because we'd spent the day talking. We'd spent the day talking to Bill Clinton, and we had plenty of access to him.
I would love
we literally would say, "Here he comes."
With me.
I want to talk to you about me.
I think that they are risk averse, and the biggest problem is we've lost our credibility. If we were seen as guardians of the public interest who wanted to talk to the candidates to elucidate their positions and to give the country a sense of what they'd like, I think they'd be willing to talk to us more. But instead, we all have video cameras on them, and we cover them. We ask questions in a way to try to embarrass them, or we look for every little slip up. So I wish they were more accessible, but I think our business bears, if not the full brunt, a lot of the brunt of it, because we don't treat them like we want to engage with them in a way that would be good for the public, but rather just bad for them.
And John, let me ask you if what a reporter, I've heard a couple reporters whispered to me as the light went off on our set, that the reason why journalists don't call the White House out on not being more available is because they know if they do, they'll be the first ones cut off.
Well, yeah, I mean, the source greasing, as it's called, and not wanting to confront people because because your limited access to not even just the principal, but to their aides will be cut off, is obviously, it's like a matter of life and death for a reporter. The worst, when your livelihood depends on being able to talk to people, if they're going to shut you off, your willingness to challenge someone who's going to shut you off in that way obviously diminishes, and that's part of it.
And the more they shut you off, the more you as a politician are rewarded, right?
It's part of the vicious cycle. But so that's one thing that's true. I'll add to what Mark said. Everything Mark said was right, but it's also, there's this economic factor, right? Which is that fewer and fewer organizations can afford to send reporters out to spend time with candidates. And so you have fewer people traveling with candidates.
Talk about your Joe Biden trip.
The candidates, and I'll use that as an example in a second, and the people who do travel are younger and cheaper. And so what the candidate confronts is what Mark just said, which is reporters who have not been doing this for very long,
Embeds.
Don't know history,
With their own
don't
cameras.
have any sense of context, and who increasingly work for ideologically driven publications where they are trying to just catch people out in gaffes and take what they say out of context, turn them into clickbait, as Sam said. And so just to be sympathetic with the politician for a second, they look at this and they say, well, what's the incentive for me to talk to these guys? They don't know history. They're going to twist my words. They're going to tweet something out of context, and I'm going to get screwed. So why do I want to talk to this kid who doesn't know anything and is only out to screw me? And this was, when I was traveling, I traveled with, I just did this cover story in the magazine on Joe Biden, and and there are two important things about this. I spent 3 days with him. First of all, traveling with the vice president was like traveling with Rick Santorum in Iowa. There were 3 national reporters who were on this trip. Three traveling with the vice president of the United States. And I was the only one for all 3 days. So there were a few embeds, they fell on and off. This was not a huge, and that's just money. It's really expensive to travel with the vice president. And for me to go out and do that for 3 days was fine because I was doing a cover story, but NBC, ABC, the Washington Post, New York Times can't afford to have someone travel with Joe Biden on Air Force Two every time he takes a trip. So there's not very many people covering him, number one. And one of the things he said to me was, exactly the thing I just said. He said, not to make myself, I'm old enough that we could have a conversation about the 1988 campaign. And he sort of said to me at one point, he's like, I can't spend, there's no reporters who cover me anymore who I can sit down and have an hour and a half long conversation with because they just don't know enough about my history, about the history of American politics.
Well, and also,
I feel like I'm talking to like a college kid, and it's just not that rewarding for me, and the risk is really high and the reward's really low.
Plus, Joe Biden knows that you're going to be around in 20 years, whereas these other people,
unless he talks me into a coronary, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
When I go out and cover Governor Romney, most trips this year that I've done, I have more political reporting experience than everyone on the plane combined.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I'm not that old.
Right.
Yeah. So is it true, more than ever, especially on the Romney? Well, actually, no. I would think the president is just as guilty. They choose their interviews, and they choose the ones that they're going to be, they cater to their base as well as to the questions that they want to get.
I've had 2 interviews with Governor Romney, so I need to object a little bit. I think I get interviews with him because they know I'll ask serious questions, and I won't try to embarrass them. I have in front of my mind what questions the public need to know the answers to help make a good choice.
But you do hear, though, Mika, grousing from people from all media organizations about how the president will do, I don't know, an interview with highlights or something like that. I don't know.
Well, but he has gone on Fox and done Bill O'Reilly. It just so, I mean, the president has.
Like 8 years ago.
Yeah, no, he has. But I see Mitt Romney going on Fox in the morning, and just choosing to do that. Safe place
But even there, Mika, you've seen when Mitt Romney has done Fox, when you've got the Bret Baier interview, where he looks at Brett and he goes, well, I didn't expect this kind of interview. You know? It's
Like, what
well,
did
what
they
did you
have?
expect?
Did they plan it?
Right, and so goes back to how we started the conversation about this relationship between the press and the politicians.
So you're a national figure. You ran the Republican Party, and you heard what John said and what Mark said, that a lot of the media is out to embarrass national figures. I guess it was a real learning experience for you.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you could do it all over again, would you follow the President Obama, Mitt Romney example and be a little more careful, bubble wrap yourself a little bit more before answering questions?
I probably would have been a little bit more careful in how I use the phraseology, you know, how I said certain things. I probably wouldn't refer to some of our efforts as, you know, hip-hop republicanism, because there were
Because it doesn't exist.
there was
but
a whole,
first of
there
all-
were a whole lot.
Yeah.
I was going to say, there were a whole lot of white folks thinking they had to put on some bling and drop their pants. And I was like, no, that's not what we're talking about. Not the same thing. But
That would be ugly.
it would be ugly. But you could get away with it.
No,
You could get
no,
away with
no,
it.
I could not.
No, but I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned in what both Mark and John are saying there for guys like me in terms of understanding what the terrain looks like. I believe that the best defense is a good offense. In other words, don't run away from the smart reporters. You want to get those guys more in the room than the folks that Sam was referring to, the guys who are looking for the click headlines, and have the conversation. One of my frustrations, and it really boiled down to trying to tell the story of what I was doing, of how I was trying to change the party and reform it. And there were just forces that didn't want that story out there because of the political ramifications of it. So that was a big frustration, getting in a room with guys who are smart and intelligent, who know the history, who can ask the right questions to put in context what you're doing. And that's what politicians often look for.
So let's move on to another subject. You know, it used to be when, you know, you guys are writing Game Change 2, and I'm not exactly sure what you're going to call it, but, you know, even 4 years ago, you could talk about the decisive moments in the campaign, which were actually moments in the campaign that made a big difference. You go back through history, and the decisive moments, 1976, Gerald Ford, unaware of the fact that the Soviets occupy Poland. Decisive moment in that debate.
That's a big one.
That was a big one. Really stopped Gerald Ford from overtaking Carter. 1980, Ronald Reagan at Nashua. We all know Mr. Green, I paid for this mic. That was a deciding moment. 88, Dukakis. You could go year through year through year. This year, in the Republican primary, the decisive moments had nothing to do, or very little to do, with what happened on the campaign trail and what happened in super PAC ads. And I want to show you an ad that Newt Gingrich had to deal with during his primary campaign with Mitt Romney, and then I want to ask you what the media's responsibility is to put these ads in perspective. Let's run number one.
Know what makes Barack Obama happy? Newt Gingrich's baggage. Newt has more baggage than the airlines. Freddie Mac helped cause the economic collapse, but Gingrich cashed in. Freddie Mac paid Newt $30,000 an hour, $1.6 million. Gingrich not only teamed up with Nancy Pelosi on global warming, but together they co-sponsored a bill that gave $60 million a year to a UN program supporting China's brutal one-child policy. As Speaker, Gingrich even supported taxpayer funding of some abortions. And Newt is the only speaker in history to be reprimanded. He was fined $300,000 for ethics violations by a Republican Congress. As Conservative National Review says, his weakness for half-baked and not especially conservative ideas made him a poor Speaker of the House. He appears unable to transform or even govern himself. Newt Gingrich, too much baggage. Restore Our Future is responsible for the content of this message.
Sam Stein with a history.
I forgot how brutal that was.
That's a long ad. It's like a war and peace.
It's just like
Fighting
killing
back.
someone.
When the history of the 2012 campaign is written, I don't know if it will include the fact that a week and a half out, Newt Gingrich was overtaking Mitt Romney in Iowa. And Romney's people were
Did its
saying,
damage.
this is an existential threat. This is the guy that could beat us.
Yeah.
They destroyed him there. He got back on his feet. And I say this is a guy that helped run Newt Gingrich out of town, not a Newt Gingrich fan. But then he wins South Carolina. And once again, they say he's an existential threat. We must destroy him. And they killed him. They killed him politically with 30-second ads. Now, whether you love Newt Gingrich or hate Newt Gingrich, I mean, isn't that a threat to the way our elect our leaders, that these 30-second ads decided who won the Republican primary this year?
I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Newt Gingrich will go down in history as the first casualty of the super PAC era. I mean, what happened to him in Florida and in Iowa, I mean, I guess you'd have to say Florida because he got up off the mat, was epic. I mean, that ad was just brutal. Sorry, is that my mic?
No, that's mine.
Okay. That ad was just brutal. And I think, you know, it does raise a really important question. Now, I know there's a philosophical argument that people should be allowed to spend however much money they want. Certainly now it's a constitutional argument. But I do think that you'd have to have your head in the sand to not agree that what we're witnessing now potentially with super PACs is a tremendous upheaval of how we do elections. And, you know, I want to just make one point. In a presidential election, it could have an impact, but at the same time, you can neutralize a super PAC with a super PAC. Where super PACs will have the most impact, in my prediction, is in state levels, where someone will come in, maybe some rich person in a district, and say, I don't like this guy, I'm going to put $1 million in a super PAC. Can you imagine what $1 million does in a state
It
legislature?
changes the race.
Oh,
It not just changes the race.
It buys
an election.
It buys the seat. And so, John, what is the media's responsibility when they see Mitt Romney destroy a candidate with 30-second spots, and then after South Carolina, he destroys the same candidate again and finishes him off? Because they knew if Gingrich won Iowa, they were done. They knew if Gingrich won Florida, they were done. Yeah. Will this be recorded in history, first of all? And secondly, in real time, doesn't the media have a responsibility to jump up and down and cry foul?
Well, I don't think that there was a lack of reporting on the notion that this was Mitt Romney's super PAC and that this was happening at the time. We saw this unfolding in real time. It wasn't like now we're just revealing the secret that this all happened. This was reported on our program on cable news and on network news and in serious newspapers and on blogs. This is well-known fact.
So how do you counterbalance that?
Well, I think that the problem with all of that is that I mean, look, there's only a limited amount to which you can counterbalance it, given what we have made decisions, as Sam pointed to, about the legality and the constitutionality of being able to, and we can have a long argument about whether that was, Citizens United was the right decision, and it's a long-term trend towards the privatization of political campaigning and spending as speech. But one thing that I think must become the standard, and it's something the press can help with, but something that also goes to something we started our conversation with, there's no one in this room, and very few voters, who know what will restore our future is. The press can point out that that's a pro-Romney super PAC, but the fact that the ad itself does not have to declare who it is that's behind the ad seems to me to be a huge problem with the system that allows anodyne names for super PACs that don't point out the affiliation. The campaigns must identify themselves. You must say, I'm Mitt Romney, I support this message. But right now, there's this massive loophole for super PACs to put up these ads anonymously, and for most low-information voters who see these ads, they have no idea where that's coming from. They have no idea what Restore Our Future is. So it seems to me that at least on one regulatory level, we have to figure out a way for there to be more disclosure on the screen of who these ads are affiliated with, and there needs to be more disclosure. If we're going to have unlimited financing in super PACs, we have to have instant disclosure for who's behind those super PACs so we can see where the money comes from, who's putting it in, and what these super PACs are constituted by.
This is a political issue, obviously, because of the Disclose Act, which encourages transparency. So it's a political issue that I think reporters are right to have a bias on, because it's in our professional obligation to actually try to get information for our readers. And so in that respect, I feel no shame in saying I'm pro-Disclose Act, because I do want to know who's funding, not the super PACs, because they have to reveal their donors, but who's funding these 501c4 organizations. I want to know who's paying for the ads. I think that is an obligation that reporters have, and I don't think it's wrong for us to say we want this.
But I agree 1,000% with you on that point. But here is where the press kind of gets back into its little bias. When they target donors, as we saw the rollout of these ads, the way that, Adelson and others Sheldon were targeted by the press and pried into their lives, their corporate existence, who they were and what they did, had nothing to do with putting $1 million in an ad.
That's silly.
I mean, well, to the
He's
extent...
he's putting 20 million, 30 million behind a super
That's-
PAC. I think
that's
it's
fine,
appropriate
but
to ask
he's
what
not,
he wants.
He's not the candidate number one, all right? Number
Still
one.
putting $30 million
He's
behind
putting
a candidate.
$30 million in, but my point is that you've got to find that line where you stop making him the story. And instead of saying that in the context of this candidate, he's receiving...
But we're not making him the story. He
No.
made himself by
Oh my
spending $30 million.
See, there's the point. And so, you know, we get the chill effect that some in the media want to have, because you didn't have that same level of scrutiny of the top-end donors, except for like a Bill Maher, which was $1 million that he put in, and that was more the entertainment value, not getting, and everyone knows Bill's politics. Bill's been out there and very public. But when you have private citizens who are using, under the law, their dollars to, you know, connote speech, to say this is who I support, we're going to have to find that balance between their donation and their public persona as part of the campaign, and whether or not you really want to spend, you know, 17 column inches on an individual donor, or you just have it as a paragraph.
Well, you know, the thing is, though, if the Koch brothers or if Adelson determine the outcome of a race, then they are a big part of the race. I will just be curious to see when Democrats catch up in the super PAC category, whether we're going to have as many column inches spent on Democratic donors, and whether you're going to actually have editorial writers draw the penciled in horns on top of their heads. I suspect that won't happen, but we'll see.
So as we move into showing number 4, this next ad, I think another question that we can throw into the pot here is, are we supposed to suspend belief that the campaigns are not working with these super PACs and the people who run them, especially when they know each other really well? And how exactly do we report on that and make that separation without looking incredibly naive? This is an ad that was put out by Priorities USA, and it makes somewhat of an accusation against Mitt Romney. Take a look.
I don't think Mitt Romney understands what he's done to people's lives by closing the plant. I don't think he realizes that people's lives completely changed. When Mitt Romney and Bain closed the plant, I lost my health care. And my family lost their health care. And a short time after that, my wife became ill. I don't know how long she was sick. And I think maybe she didn't say anything because she knew that we couldn't afford the insurance. And then one day she became ill, and then I took her up to the Jackson County Hospital and admitted her for pneumonia, and that's when they found the cancer. And by then it was stage 4. There was nothing they could do for her. And she passed away in 22 days. I do not think Mitt Romney realizes what he's done to anyone. And furthermore, I do not think Mitt Romney is concerned.
Priorities USA Action is responsible for the content of this advertising.
So that's a tragic story. The gentleman's been in, like, I think 14 Obama ads over the past couple of years. But I will say, I exaggerate a little bit. I will say, though, here's a good example, Mark, where the, quote, liberal media also called out an ad that had some facts it didn't string together. And I think most in the media, from the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, will probably say that this is an ad that backfired badly on the president. But the part of the story that you really didn't hear from the very beginning, and maybe it's because we're all in this little club and we all like Bill Burton very much. You know, we had Robert Gibbs come on our show and basically go, "Bill who? I haven't seen this ad." Come on! We saw Gibby and Burton throughout 2008. I mean, they're joined together, and
Are they not talking now?
but the thing is, it is like a club. Don't we have a responsibility to say, okay, these guys are so coordinated, whether they're doing it with a nod and a wink or not? Don't we have as much of a responsibility? And same thing with the Romney. The Romney Super PAC, which was run by all of Mitt Romney's former staff members. I mean, it's a joke.
Bill Burton goes from being a deputy White House press secretary to running the super PAC, and and remains proud of that ad. You know, part of the problem I have as a human being / reporter is when the Obama campaign is indignant about the first ad we looked at, the welfare ad. How dare they put an ad on like that? And they're a campaign that not only had a super PAC ad that they did not repudiate, that suggested Mitt Romney killed that man's wife, but spent a lot of the winter and spring making a big deal of Mitt Romney saying things like, I like to fire people, and I don't care about poor people, and taking them out of context. So it's difficult for me often to get all that exercised about either side's complaint about the other ads when they're both doing things that, if the other side did it, they'd be screaming bloody murder.
Now, does it make a difference to you, or John, to you, that one was directly connected with the campaign, the welfare reform ad, which is false, and one was connected to a super PAC where the ad didn't even run on the air? Does that make a difference to you?
Virtually none, because as candidate Barack Obama said in 2008, when super PAC ads were being run by North Carolina's John Edwards against him, he said it's very easy, just speak out.
Wait. Why didn't we hear a big cheer? You just said hometown boy John Edwards. My gosh, you people turn on your own awfully quick.
The pride of the party state.
It's not a hometown crowd.
Dean Smith, Michael Jordan, and John Edwards.
And John Edwards, that's a triumvirate.
Yeah.
All right, so anyway.
He said in 2008, he said, you know, just speak out and denounce the ad. And the people who run your super PAC who are pretty close to you will get the message that you don't want that ad. Now, as you said, that ad did not run more than 1 or 2 times, but they knew what they were doing.
And John, they never did call that ad out. They never did condemn Bill Burton.
And you know, that's the thing. I mean, we've seen candidates who say things. Mitt Romney, I believe on our show, at some point said, well, I can't say anything about that. I can't do anything because we're not allowed to coordinate. And we rightly, in the days after that, said, well, that's ridiculous. That's not coordination. If you don't like the ad, you can stand up. Your free speech rights haven't been repealed. You can stand up and say, I don't like that ad. I denounce that ad. Don't run that ad. You can tell your super PAC that's how you feel about it. The president could have done the same thing here. The president could have stood up and said, the guys at Priorities USA have made a lot of ads that I stand by 100%, but I don't stand by this one.
So we have more media outlets than ever before. We have more fact-checking organizations than ever before. And yet, Michael, still, it seems like both sides are playing faster and more loose with the truth than ever before. Most of these 30-second ads that Americans are watching are just pure garbage.
They are.
And again, because I'm a Republican, I'll give another good Republican example. This Medicare ad, which is unbelievably successful, talks about Barack Obama cutting $716 billion. Well, that's what Republicans proposed in Paul Ryan's budget.
Yep.
And yet it runs, it's effective, and somehow the media is not able to educate people to the fact that this is demagoguery.
Well, I think it goes to something I believe John touched on earlier, and that is these ads aren't designed for us, number one. They're designed for folks who tune in. It's in between, their hot show that they're watching at that moment. Real Wheel of Fortune. It's 30 seconds in the middle of Wheel of Fortune, and it catches their eye.
Yeah.
And this is not about applying people with substance. This is about getting a visceral reaction to what they see, to this visual stimulus. And then that translates into a conversation they'll have with a friend. Did you see that ad that Mitt Romney did X or President Obama did Y? And that's the base political objective here, which is why these negative ads are so successful, because they go to the baser instincts in us to see that conflict that you referred to, Sam, that people like to prey in on. And so that's the reality.
I think the bigger problem is that campaigns have made the calculation that it's more important for them or more beneficial for them to run these ads and get tarnished as liars or whatever you want to put it than it is to stay in the truth-telling script. And I noticed that Neil Newhouse, the pollster for Mitt Romney, I think last week said that the welfare ad was their most successful ad to date. And he said, we don't want to be dictated by fact-checkers.
Well, the welfare ad is successful.
And the Medicare ad has neutralized what was a polling disadvantage on Medicare has now become much more neutral.
They've got a polling advantage. And you talk to both sides off the record, and they will quietly say, it's working. Speaking of visceral reaction, we need to go to questions, but Mark,
more than any presidential campaign I've ever covered, the attitude in both Chicago and Boston and in the White House is we're not going to back down. Because if we back down, our supporters on blogs and Twitter will go crazy and say we wimped out. and the other side will just be emboldened to do worse things. So no one's going to take an ad off the air.
What's the price you pay for running something negative?
And that's the question. What is the media at this point so dispersed? Is it so weak that it doesn't have the power to stand up and beat these candidates?
Well, and I'll raise the
with the truth.
I'll raise the troubling specter. You know, I think we started this conversation by saying the media has an obligation to call out people for things that are just objectively false, and yet the thing that you just pointed out, which is that you said, despite the fact that there's this proliferation of fact-checking and calling out, we see more of this. I actually wonder whether it's because of the proliferation that we have now so much fact-checking going on. And again, I start by saying fact-checking is a good thing. And yet, just as a matter of media anthropology, you look at all the different fact-checking organizations. You got people giving out Pinocchios. You got people giving out all these different systems. And you have so many people now yelling, pants on fire, blah, 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 that you wonder whether some audience members just go, you know, it's just more of the bullshit of everybody's calling each other names.
Can you say that in North Carolina?
They all
We
lie.
okay? We good?
They're so cynical about politics and the media that the attitude is they all lie all the time. The media is all biased all the time. I can't believe anything I hear. Forget about it.
I'm giving that answer 5 Halperins.
Forget
it's
about
just
it.
remotely.
5 Halperins.
Yeah, it's just not true. So anyway, that's our fact checking. So Mika,
Questions
it's
from the
time for
audience.
questions. I'm very
if there
excited
are
about
any,
this.
and I'm not sure how this process works, is there a microphone or should I come out to you?
Are you going to stand up and scream? You can stand up and scream.
Waving arms over there.
Oh, I like waving arms. Yes.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Yost, a sophomore at Winthrop University. First, Mr. Stein, I'm a big fan of the HuffPo and their nuclear headlines.
There you go.
But not the boat shoes.
Look at that.
Oh, no. I can say as a college student that your boat shoes are absolutely frat-tastic, so.
Frat-tastic. Frat-tastic, I love it. You're making me blush. Okay.
But I did see recently, actually on the Huffington Post, a video of Melissa Harris Perry's discussion on the term welfare and how because of the media and the rhetoric surrounding the term welfare, it has become a negative term in the public eye. People relate welfare to lazy people receiving government money while obviously supporting the same notion of supporting the less fortunate. As a result, we now see others playing off of this notion, such as Governor Romney's ad on putting work back into welfare. We have discussed the media responding to such lowly rhetoric, but in a way, is it not the media that starts this? How accountable is the media, especially the televised media, in putting these ideologies out into the public sphere, and should they be held accountable?
Yes, Sam.
Sam, the answer there.
Yes, Sam.
15 seconds
First of all,
or less.
I'll pay you $20 later for that kind introduction. Thank you. You know, I do think, you know, when you present these issues, obviously you have to be very careful with how you word them. And I know sometimes one of the problems with today's media is that we rush things up so fast, especially online, that we don't sit back and look at how we're exactly phrasing things. And I've been called out many, many more times than I want to be called out by readers for you know, phrasing things wrongly and putting in a perception that I didn't mean to put in there to begin with. I think this welfare thing is sort of one of those examples that, you know, there are so many connotations to the issue. I don't want to dismiss them. I think there are really serious connotations to the issue. Some of them are racial. Some of them have to deal with just, you know, the idea that of government dependency. That I think it is worthwhile for a lot of the press to step back and say, okay, am I phrasing this correctly? Am I perpetuating a stereotype? How am I presenting the issue? But it's not cut and dry. Everything is, you know, we all make editorial judgments and we have to live with them.
All right, over here.
Yes, my name is Richard Cronk. I'm from Concord, by way of Florida originally, so we have something in common. My question.
It sounds like, in your mind, we have one thing in common. And one
no,
thing
actually, I'm a Republican. But,
okay.
but the biggest question I have. My first election was the 1980 election when you had no internet, you had 3 major TV stations, newspapers were something well read. I have 2 young sons who are in college who will vote in their first election this year. They have the internet, and that's what they see, and that's what they read. They don't read the newspaper. They don't watch TV shows. And with 1 million different ideas and bloggers, and anybody can be a news outlet on the internet, who's the standard bearer? Who are we looking to, and who, in your opinion, are the ones that are going to be the ones that hold the truths out there in the media. I have a pretty lifelong experience in reading various things, but everybody can have an opinion now. So how do we make them accountable, and what are we going to do?
Well, you know, the authority 4 years ago, as far as Mika and I are concerned, was Tim Russert. And we sure miss him because Tim was a guy that when Tim spoke, people listened. When I was growing up, it was Walter Cronkite in our house. My dad would call him a commie every night, but we still believed when he said that's the way it is, that's the way we believed it was. We don't have those people out there now. And for my 24-year-old son, and probably for your son, they get a lot of their news from Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and online. And yes, exactly. One more reason why the Chinese are overtaking us. We're screwed. That said, though, I'm not as cynical as everybody else, because when I hear my son and his friends talking about politics in between discussing basketball and football and soccer, they're pretty up to snuff. They don't sit down like I did growing up and read the New York Times and watch CBS Evening News, but they somehow get a good bit of information. And I'm not quite as cynical. I don't know about the rest of you guys.
I think that it's fair to say that in the grand tradition of Walter Cronkite, Tim Russert, now we have Sam Stein and BuzzFeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's pretty much, I'm comfortable with that.
It's a lot of information, but people somehow were able to sort through it. Yes, next.
This is Moin Khan, having traveled more than 10,000 miles from Bangladesh
I bet you're
to the
disappointed.
US to learn about your democracy.
Yeah. All right.
It perplexes me sometimes when we see that during your elections, the candidate gives advertisements which talks about the negative sides of his opponents rather than depicting the positive sides of his own candidature. Although I have been in the parliament in Bangladesh for 16 years, and having come from a country where people say that we are a democracy in transition, and sometimes people even say that we are pursuing confrontational politics, even then, I don't quite understand why the election ads in the US follow the style what I have just described.
So,
is it that here in the US, the psyche of the voters is that for a negative voting pattern?
So John Heilemann, the ads are getting more negative. They do still work. Do you sense a point where Americans will be burned out by that? We keep saying which one of these candidates is going to talk about what they're going to do the next 4 years instead of talking about Bain or talking about what Barack Obama did over the past 4 years.
I think we are entering into, genuinely uncharted territory. And we talk about this in the context of this presidential election a lot. That if you take all the Republican spending and you compare it to all the Democrat spending, you've got Republicans maybe going to spend $1.5 billion on this general election. Democrats going to spend maybe $1 billion. So that's $2.5 billion, let's say. 2.5 times as much as was spent, 2.5 times as much as was spent in 2008. No one, and mostly, as we all know, in somewhere between 6, 7, 8 states. So most of the country's not going to see these ads. Most of that money is going to get spent in those few states. That is like a test tube chemistry experiment. There is no precedent for that. And one thing that, if you want to be hopeful about things, is that there will be so much negativity and so much overkill that it will finally come to the point where we have the metaphorical moment that we all kind of have pined for, which is that people basically take their TV sets and smash them on the grounds. Not physically, but if it turns out at the end of this election that all that spending, in fact, didn't really work, didn't really move the needle, that might be the point at which things start to actually change.
Let me make a point, because a lot of the negativity's been with us for a while, and I do agree that it's probably more pronounced in this cycle than it has ever been. That's what we see on the television airways. I think when you talk to these campaign operatives about how to actually persuade voters to go out and vote, because negativity is designed to get people to not vote. When you talk to them how they go up to persuade vote, what they say is the most effective way is to have someone who you know knock on your door and talk to you about what this person's going to do in a positive light or positive frame. So we get a lot of the negativity shown to us in these video clips on the cable news networks, but there is an element of positive campaigning that goes on under the surface that we just aren't really aware of. So I wouldn't say it's totally out. I mean, I do think there is some balance there.
There is, I think to your point, John, what you just said is reflected in the polls. I mean, after all that we've seen and heard over the past 18 months, where are we? 47, 47, 47,
Exactly where we were
46.
6 months ago. Yeah.
Exactly
so
where we
much
were
money
6
spent
months.
to do nothing.
I mean, you've got $1 billion already on the table that's been spent in a handful of states, and the electorate is saying, we haven't made up our mind yet. And so I think that money, this is going to be one of those elections where all this money is going to prove worthless because people put it in context, they understand what it's all about, and they're going to make up their own minds. And I think that really goes back to what I saw in 2009 and 2010. Despite the efforts by the Democrats at that time to keep control, the people were moving in a different direction, and the polls reflected that sense of momentum. You saw it beginning over the summer and certainly turned right into the fall campaign. They were driving this.
All right, we're going to get another question over here. Let's try and get a few more in. Keep your questions tight and your answers tighter, Joe.
I'll try.
Okay.
But I do have to tell you, when I was in Congress,
Yes.
I'm Monroe Gilmore, and I'm a lucky parent chaperone with a group of young journalists from Owen High School in the mountains of North Carolina. And I was a bit concerned about the initial discussion and Mika's point. Isn't there a methodology to being a journalist and in professional standards and the types of things that should guard you from your own biases? I mean, no one is a robot, and yet it seems like there should be some standards that these young journalists can aspire to. And I'd appreciate your comments.
first of all, the methodology has to do with a lot of alcohol. John Heilemann will tell you, you drink and drink and drink until you're numb, and then you drink some more.
Okay.
That's step one. No, you know, look, can I give a fascinating example of how I think a lot of journalists work, and I'm not calling myself a journalist. I'm not exactly sure what I am. But I will tell you, it's so fascinating. How long did we talk around the Morning Joe table about the Republican nomination? We talked about it for 2 years, 3 hours a day, nonstop. I got my absentee ballot, and I looked at the list, and I shocked myself. I immediately go, Gingrich, no. Romney, no. Big government Republican, you know. Santorum, no, that's not going to work. I go down the list, and then I see Ron Paul. I go, oh, yeah. And I scratch Ron Paul, put it in the envelope, and sit my absentee ballot in, and I shocked myself. You quit laughing, okay? If you were in the Republican Party, you may have been forced to vote for him, too. So but that was a really revealing moment to me that I promise you, I never once even considered who I was going to vote for. It just, in fact, I wrote a column about it. I was so surprised by just my gut reaction. I was like, that's easy. Okay, I'm going to fix a peanut butter jelly sandwich now for my kids. Hopefully, reporters are able to disconnect themselves that way. And hopefully, they're also very honest. I just told you who I voted for. And hopefully, they're honest enough with themselves. Because I'll tell you what, it's a bunch of crap, all right? I don't want to hear some journalist say, well, you know, I'm not biased neutral. And I'm neutral in this campaign. That's a lie. No. I mean, seriously, if you were living in America in 2012 and there's a $17 trillion national debt and we're running trillion-dollar deficits every year and we're in an endless war in Afghanistan and young Americans are dying and we're wasting $2 billion a week and our entitlement system is going belly up and the average wage of Americans have been dropping since 1973, and you don't have an opinion on what we need to do to fix this? You are too stupid to be given a driver's license, let alone work in the media. So don't tell me you don't have an opinion. That's what I find the most offensive. The question is, how do you put up those Chinese walls to report, and then when you go home, to decide privately?
Yeah.
Right, that's the question.
And Mika has the answer right now. So Mika, you got alcohol. How else do you do it?
Yes, exactly. You go to the bar. You make a great point, though, and I would say to your students that I understand that they're going to have to understand safeguards, try and understand how to be objective as possible, especially given the standards that are set out there in most major networks, broadcasts, and major newspapers. Because we're not going to be transparent. At least reporters still aren't. They don't say who they are, who they voted for, where they came from. They're supposed to remain objective. But I would suggest to your students that they read and they feel something about what they're reading, and they have opinions.
Have opinions,
okay?
but when you're reporting...
Because there's too many young people actually coming into the TV business so excited about being on TV, they have no opinions, and they hide behind the fact that it's just objective, and they don't have to say anything. And I think that's even more fearful. I think they have to be educated, they have to learn to feel and develop ideas of their own. And then, of course, you try and be as fair as you can. Look, do you think that I'm every morning trying to push an agenda or trying to be fair? That's your call.
Never mind. Yeah.
And you don't have to watch the show if you don't think that I'm a fair person.
Yeah, you're fair.
There's a simple answer too, which is make sure before they hit publish that they call everyone in the story and at least get them to give their side and hear them out. Doesn't mean they have to put their comment in there, but you know, at least let them tell their side of the story so that they are educated fully before hitting publish.
And
those are standards that have nothing to do with opinion. That's just the rules of reporting.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's simple rules
But you
of
know,
reporting.
Mark, I always tell, because I have a lot of Republicans, like my mom, saying, why do you say mean things about the Republican
She
Party?
only watches Fox.
She writes really nasty emails to me. But, you know, I always say, though, to my Republican friends, I say, you know, I'm like a ref in a game. And the last thing you would want if you're an Alabama fan would be for me to be reffing an Alabama game. Because every close call would go to the other team. I would bend over backwards to make sure. Is that what you sense at Time Magazine and other news organizations, that there is an attempt to counterbalance internal biases?
Well, look, keep in mind that for students who are trying to understand how to be journalists, most of the bias problems only come up if you're covering politics. If you're covering other beats, for the most part, they're mechanical things, as Sam said, that you need to do. But if you can learn how to be a good reporter, get facts, make sure you've called everybody, think through where the compelling story is and where the public interest is served, it doesn't really matter unless you've got extreme bias, ideological bias. It doesn't matter on most beats. In terms of politics, you know, I disagree a little bit with some of what's been said. I think that if you are a liberal or a conservative and you can't report objectively on Mitt Romney or Barack Obama, you should be in a different line of work. Those jobs should be held in the main, except at ideologically oriented places, by people who can be objective and who can say, whatever I might think, I'm here to serve the public interest and give the public the best information possible about the choice that they face in terms of who the people are, what they believe in, what they do as they got elected.
Mark's last point, I'll just very quickly say, I think it might be that objectivity, because things that Mika has said are right, that objectivity may be an unobtainable goal. It may be impossible for human beings to be objective and have no views and not be, invested and have convictions and have opinions. But we can hold up the notion of accuracy and fairness. And maybe that's a reasonable replacement set of standards, because if you're trying to say things that are accurate, always accurate, and you're trying to be fair and represent both sides of an argument fairly and understand what each side is trying to say in a sympathetic way, in the sense that you say, I'm trying to understand what these guys are arguing, what these guys are arguing. These are facts. I know these are accurate. And I'm trying to present this issue with an eye towards fairness, that's a reasonable stand-in for the false god of objectivity.
Mika,
or it's a different way of saying the same thing.
I think it's an imperfect science, and transparency can help.
Let me just finish. I know we've got to wrap, but let me just finish on a positive note with Michael Steele. And I'm going to ask you, Michael, if your opinion is the same as mine. As a conservative, as a Republican who, you know, we walk around with a chip on our shoulder saying the media is biased. I have noticed over the past 5 to 10 years, we've moved a bit beyond the post-Watergate world of journalism. When I see young reporters, and whether you're talking about Jeff Zeleny or Jim Rutenberg or, you know, Mark Leibovich, if you can still call him young at the Times, I'm talking about the Times especially here. I just, you know what, I see a lot more objectivity in reporters in their 20s and their 30s than, say, reporters in their 50s and their 60s that were raised during a different time, when being a journalist was about ending the war in Vietnam and taking down Nixon.
Everyone had an agenda. I think you're absolutely right. I think these modern-day reporters and to the students who are looking to this as a profession, yes, they have their biases and they have their experiences, but there is this overwhelming sense of trying to just get it right and to tell the story and to put out there for people to decide for themselves as they have decided for themselves, maybe at the encouragement of a mom or a dad or a very good teacher, to get it right, to do it right. And so that's where I hold out hope. And when you do that, just make sure, if you ever write about me, I was not at the club.
Exactly.
Yes,
Well, listen, we want to thank, first of all, a big hand for everybody on the panel.
Thank you.
And students, I want to leave you with 2 thoughts since we have students here. 1, when you get your big break, leave your boat shoes in your parents' house. And 2, be ready.
I'm getting booed for that.
John Edwards, 2016, he's coming back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.